December 1944. The Western Front. The night was thick with mist and the slow hiss of falling rain. Beneath the broken arch of a bridge once proud and vital, a handful of U.S. Army engineers moved like shadows against the blackened steel. The river below whispered with the current, cold, relentless, and rising. Overhead, the sky flashed faintly from distant artillery, each burst revealing faces streaked with mud and exhaustion. The bridge had been destroyed days earlier by retreating German forces, a jagged skeleton of twisted girders and splintered planks. Now, instead of rebuilding it to cross, the Americans were rebuilding it to deceive. Every hammer strike was muffled under wet cloth. Every wire laid was a silent promise of what was to come. They worked by instinct, not orders, crafting what looked like repair, but was in truth an elaborate trap meant to lure the enemy back across their own ruin. In the distance, a German patrol watched through binoculars, convinced the Americans were desperate to restore the crossing. They didn't know they were watching the making of their own disaster, and as the engineers tightened the final fuse line, one of them whispered, "Let them come." By the winter of 1944, the Allied advance across Western Europe had slowed to a grinding crawl. After the triumph of Normandy, the race through France had burned through fuel, supplies, and lives. Every mile gained brought heavier resistance and colder weather. As the German army fell back toward its homeland, it followed one iron rule: leave nothing standing behind. Bridges and the arteries of movement were systematically destroyed. Every crossing over rivers and canals was wired, mined, and reduced to twisted debris before the Americans could reach it. To the German command, this wasn't just delay, it was survival. If the Allies couldn't cross, they couldn't pursue. For the men of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, these ruins became their battlefield. They were no longer just builders. They were combatants in the invisible war of logistics, the struggle to keep the Allied spearheads supplied and mobile. With every bridge lost, entire divisions risked isolation, tanks stranded, artillery halted. The engineers worked under fire, repairing, bridging, and improvising faster than any army in history. Pontoon bridges rose in hours where the enemy thought days would be needed. Timber trestles replaced shattered spans overnight. What began as a technical service evolved into a frontline arm of combat ingenuity. Yet as the Allies pushed deeper into German-held territory, a new kind of challenge emerged: deception. The Germans had begun watching. They learned the patterns, the methods, the routines of American bridging operations. They knew where engineers would appear and when. And that knowledge made them dangerous. In the Ardennes, where dense forests and narrow valleys forced the armies into predictable paths, every crossing became a potential death trap. German artillery zeroed in on bridge sites even before the first American trucks arrived. Snipers waited for engineers, knowing their destruction would stall entire advances. It was in this environment of constant observation and counteraction that the idea of turning a destroyed bridge into a weapon first surfaced. Among the units operating in the sector was a detachment of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, veterans of Normandy and the push through France. They had seen bridges collapse under enemy fire, watched comrades die in freezing rivers, and learned one bitter truth: a bridge could be just as deadly when it was being built as when it was destroyed. Late in December, as the Battle of the Bulge raged to the south, American forces in the north held a fragile line near the Siegfried defenses. The Germans were desperate to counterattack, to find a weak point and push back across the same crossings they had once demolished. Intelligence reports suggested that an armored reconnaissance element, part of a Panzer Grenadier division, was preparing to test the line near a recently destroyed bridge over a small tributary of the Our River, near the Belgian border. The engineers sent to the site faced a paradox. They couldn't rebuild under enemy observation, and they couldn't leave it untouched. The broken span had become a signal of a challenge in the chessboard of war. If it remained in ruins, it limited Allied mobility. If it was restored, it risked drawing artillery. So their commanding officer proposed a third option: let the enemy believe it was being rebuilt. This was more than a tactical trick. It was a transformation of the engineering mindset. Instead of seeing the bridge as an obstacle to overcome, they saw it as bait. Every twisted beam, every hanging plank, every half-driven rivet could become part of a deception powerful enough to shape a battle. The plan would demand stealth, coordination, and precision under fire. And it would depend on one thing the Germans still underestimated: the creative audacity of the American engineer. As the snow began to fall harder over the Ardennes, the engineers prepared their tools. But this time they weren't building for crossing. They were building for killing. They were building for killing. The ruined span sat like a wound across the valley, a ribbon of broken concrete and steel teeth spanning a dark, narrow river. On the map, it was insignificant, a minor crossing on a secondary road. In practice, it mattered because of patterns. Narrow roads funneled traffic. Woods hid movement. Snow and mud funneled armor and trucks into predictable lines. An enemy that thought it understood those lines could be led into a trap. The plan began with observation. Patrols and field intelligence kept watch on German movement for days. Signal intercepts and prisoner interrogations suggested the Germans would probe American positions along that corridor, looking for weak points to exploit after the Ardennes offensive. Reconnaissance planes and forward observers noted the same thing. German formations, short on fuel and desperate for crossings, were testing bridges that looked recently repaired. That pattern the enemy drew to an apparent opportunity was the seed of the ambush. Command approved a deception that was surgical, not cinematic. The engineers would not rebuild a safe crossing. They would simulate one. Timber frames, plank decking, and fresh saw cuts would be fashioned to look like a working repair. New whitewashed timbers would be set on the ruined piers. Ropes and pulley blocks would dangle visibly. Fresh drill marks and a staged supply dump would imply hurried restoration. From a distance, through a pair of binoculars, the crossing would read as tempting and temporary, exactly the kind of soft target German forces preferred. Beneath that visible layer, the Americans laid the real work: concealment of explosive charges and pre-sighted fields of fire. Demolition teams hid charges in the remaining girders and in false cribbing beneath the decking. Delay fuses and electrical firing lines were threaded through hollow logs and buried under loose soil, allowing remote detonation after the enemy committed to the crossing. Engineers dug concealed foundations for temporary scaffolds that would collapse in a controlled way, channeling vehicles into kill zones prepared on both banks. Artillery and anti-tank assets were integrated into the plan. Forward observers pre-registered coordinates on both sides of the river. Forward artillery pieces were given precise grid bearings to fire immediately on pre-arranged targets. Anti-tank guns and tank destroyers were placed in hidden emplacements, their arcs of fire rehearsed against a simulated approach. Infantry squads, briefed on timing and signals, would bar the exits and catch survivors. Machine gun teams had interlocking sectors already painted on maps. Camouflage and sound played roles equal to steel. Engineers staged the noises of repair hammering at intervals, a staccato of saws. The clatter of crates moved just where enemy scouts could hear them. Smoke generators and small controlled fires added plausibility to the scene. Crews deliberately left footsteps and fresh tracks leading toward the bridge. They even rolled a few patched tires into view and left empty ration cans by mock toolboxes. Everything obvious was meant to be obvious. Commanders argued over risk. A real repair would have opened Allied mobility sooner. A trap risked wasting scarce engineering manpower and exposing them to artillery. The compromise was timing. The deception would be staged long enough for German scouts to report it and for an enemy force to commit, but not longer than necessary. If the Germans did not take the bait within a narrow window, the plan would be abandoned and the engineers would move on to build real crossings elsewhere. Training and rehearsal were crucial. The engineers practiced laying and concealing charges under blackout conditions. Artillery crews synchronized watches down to the minute. Infantry rehearsed the sequence of signals that would trigger the coordinated fires. The night before the operation, officers walked the ground by flashlight, marking concealments with invisible chalk and confirming line of sight and fields of fire. The men understood that the success of the plan demanded absolute timing, and that any slip could turn the trap into a slaughter of their own. One unexpected factor worked in the Americans' favor: overconfidence. The German command, stretched thin and under pressure to regain momentum, had become accustomed to quick tests and probing attacks. They expected the Americans to be eager and vulnerable at a newly repaired crossing. That expectation was the weapon the engineers intended to exploit. When the day came, the ruined bridge looked convincingly half-mended. From the tree line across the valley, A German reconnaissance party reported their observation. Men at work, fresh timber, a lighted lantern on the far bank. Orders were sent to bring forward a spearhead to test the crossing. The Germans believed they were exploiting an Allied weakness. They did not suspect that every visible repair concealed a carefully measured death trap. Beneath the staged repairs, the detonators were checked one last time. Artillery observers rehearsed their call signs and final corrections. The infantry squadrons kneeling in their foxholes watched the tracks that led toward the bridge and felt the taut quiet of anticipation. Engineers, whose daily work was to make things that lasted, now prepared ruins that would fall exactly where they intended. The plan was not a gambler's toss. It was a calculation of geometry, timing, and psychology. If it worked, a few minutes of chaos would destroy enemy vehicles, shatter morale, and buy vital time for Allied columns elsewhere. If it failed, men and tools would be lost in a bitter lesson about the price of deception. They finished the visible work and melted away into cover. On the far bank, an American officer checked his watch and whispered the last order. The scene settled into that peculiar electric stillness that comes just before violence. The engineers had made a bridge that invited passage and courted destruction. Now they waited to see whether the enemy would step onto it. The moment the first German tracks crunched into view, everything that had been rehearsed would have to move like one machine. The bridge's false life would end, and the real plan would begin with an explosion that would turn crossing into catastrophe and observation into complete surprise. War often reduces men to functions as rifleman, gunner, sapper. But the engineers who shaped the bridge trap defied that simplification. They were not men of brute force or loud heroism. Their strength lay in patience, method, and nerve. They were the kind of soldiers who could spend hours in mud under enemy fire, adjusting a charge by half an inch, because the math demanded it. Many were not professional soldiers at all before the war. They had been carpenters, surveyors, mechanics, or civil engineers. Their war began not with rifles but with rulers and wrenches. Yet in the chaos of Europe, they found themselves doing what textbooks never imagined building structures meant not to last, but to kill. They lived with paradoxes. To create something convincing enough to fool a German officer meant accepting that it would end in fire. Each nail, each plank they placed became a part of a calculated illusion, and each illusion carried the weight of risk. If they were seen too soon, artillery would rain on them. If they miswired a fuse, their own bridge could take them first. Still, they worked with a kind of grim artistry that only soldiers who build can understand. One engineer later wrote that the hardest part wasn't the danger, but the silence. You could hear your own heartbeat against the wire. We weren't fighting. We were waiting for the enemy to believe. That waiting psychological strain defined their courage. It was not a sudden act of valor, but a continuous endurance, stretched across freezing nights, hunger, and the weight of responsibility. They knew that one mistake in their geometry could kill dozens of their own infantrymen later. Every decision mattered. Every calculation was personal. Tactically, the bridge trap was not just a clever stunt, it represented a shift in Allied thinking. By late 1944, both sides had learned that traditional strategies were predictable. Attacks met counterattacks. Bridges were built and blown in endless repetition. To win, one side had to think asymmetrically, not in terms of firepower, but perception. The American command recognized that the Germans, though beaten back, still relied heavily on reconnaissance and habit. Their doctrine taught them to exploit temporary Allied structures, pontoon bridges, field repairs, and half-built crossings which they saw as vulnerable spots. This doctrine, once effective, became a blind spot. The deception turned that habit against them. The engineers didn't just rebuild the bridge. They rebuilt German confidence. The illusion was designed to fit perfectly into the enemy's expectations. The Americans knew that when a German officer saw a span that appeared half-finished, he'd read it as a sign of weakness, a point where a sudden thrust could break through before the Allies were ready. The plan's real genius lay in timing and geometry. The explosives weren't set to simply destroy the bridge. They were arranged to fold it, collapsing inwards and blocking the river exit. The geometry of the demolition was calculated to catch vehicles in a V-shaped kill zone, where crossfire from both banks could converge. Once detonated, the bridge would not only destroy what stood on it, but trap what tried to retreat. Artillery coordination was critical. The pre-registered fire zones meant that the first salvo could land within seconds of detonation, turning confusion into annihilation. To the Germans, the trap would look like a random stroke of bad luck, another failed assault. But to the tacticians behind it, it was proof that engineering could be as decisive as infantry. In the language of war reports, this deception would be marked simply as denied enemy crossing, but in truth, it represented something more profound, a battle of wits where shovels and rulers won against armor and guns. Behind every successful deception lies technology, not the futuristic kind, but the practical mastery of the tools at hand. The engineers of 1944 had no digital aids, no sensors, no drones. What they had was precision under pressure. They used composition C2, an early plastic explosive favored for its stability in cold weather, molded directly into the remaining steel joints of the bridge. Electrical detonation circuits were powered by hand-cranked generators linked to insulated cable reels, often scavenged from field telephones. To conceal wiring, they used one of the simplest methods in the book, wrapping the lines in mud-soaked cloth and running them through the natural cracks in the stone abutments. For disguise, the engineers turned to artistry. They used camouflage nets to hide broken sections but deliberately left gaps that would look unfinished. Tar and soot were applied to old girders to simulate recent burn marks, as though the Americans were still repairing bomb damage. Everything visible was designed to tell a story, and everything invisible was designed to end it. Even the placement of debris was technical. Engineers studied how twisted rebar reflected light under foggy conditions, ensuring the bridge looked half-built from German optics at specific distances. They positioned abandoned tools at angles that mimicked careless human activity. These tiny details invisible to the untrained eye made the deception authentic. Then came the fuse system, a dual circuit. One electric, one manual. If the remote detonation line was cut by shellfire, the engineers could still trigger the charges from a nearby position using a manual blasting cap. Redundancy was survival. It's easy to forget that every detail was done under fire. Sniper rounds snapped across the river daily. Frostbite cracked the men's hands as they twisted wire nuts, and yet the system held. When the moment came, the bridge would behave exactly as designed to appear real until it wasn't, to stand until it swallowed what it invited. Technology didn't just support the deception, it defined its success. The enemy's eyes saw carpentry. The engineer's mind saw physics, chemistry, and timing woven into one lethal equation. To understand the trap, you must first understand the enemy who walked into it. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was a service stretched thin. Elite units had been shattered in the east. Fuel was scarce. Replacements were younger, older, or simply less trained. Yet doctrine and habit remained powerful guides. German reconnaissance relied on quick probes and disciplined interpretation. A half-repaired bridge signaled opportunity, a chance to push through, exploit a seam, and restore lost momentum. Recon patrols would test defenses with light spearhead trucks, a company of infantry, perhaps a few armored cars. If resistance proved light, heavier formations followed. This pattern was predictable. It was also logical. A commander under pressure will seek the shortest solution to a supply problem. For Germans low on fuel and eager to blunt Allied advances, a repaired crossing promised access to fuel dumps and staging areas. The decision to probe was rarely reckless. It was a calculated risk shaped by the map and the timetable. But that logic contained an assumption: what you see is what you get. The Germans expected battle damage or hastily replaced planks. They did not expect artifice. They did not expect the Americans to weaponize repair. That cognitive blind spot habituated expectation was the true vulnerability the engineers exploited. When German scouts reported eager hands and fresh timber, command approved the test. Orders moved down the chain in the familiar military cadence. Move forward, secure the crossing. Hold while engineers finish the job. No one in that chain imagined the crossing itself would be the trap. That misjudgment came not from stupidity, but from a sensible habit of reading the battlefield in 3 dimensions: terrain, enemy, and time, without factoring deception into the equation. Leadership in this operation was not grand gestures but calibrated restraint. The officer who greenlit the deception balanced opportunity against risk. He understood the cost of miscalculation and the political pressures pressing on all fronts. Eisenhower's timetable, supply lines, and the morale of troops still raw from the winter fighting He trusted his engineers. That trust was earned, not given. These were battalions with experience in Normandy's hell and in the muddy hell of the Scheldt. Higher command gave latitude because the engineers' past performance suggested they could be counted on to calculate probability and to manage consequences. Coordination was the leader's weapon. The plan required synchronized watches, verified grid coordinates, and clear radio discipline. Field artillery commanders agreed to withhold fire until the exact moment to avoid tipping the deception. Infantry captains rehearsed positions to seal escape routes. Observers marked secondary targets should the enemy deploy unexpected maneuvers. Leadership also meant contingency. Commanders prepared extraction plans for their own men. They arranged fallback positions, medical evacuation routes, and clear rules of engagement should the gambit collapse. This was not reckless bravado. It was the work of commanders who understood that deception magnified both gain and risk. Orders were crisp. Briefings were tight, and when the trap was set, leaders watched quietly from concealed positions, measuring enemy response like surgeons monitoring a patient's pulse. Their restraint ensured the trap remained a controlled instrument rather than a chaotic gamble. There is a moral weight to turning a repair into a weapon. Engineers are builders by trade. War transforms their tools into instruments of death. That transition sits uneasily with many who study the ethics of combat. To the men who laid the timbers and wired the detonators, the justification was pragmatic. The destroyed bridge had been an obstacle to Allied movement and a potential avenue for German recovery. Using it to inflict damage minimized the need for broader, bloodier battles elsewhere. If a trap could destroy a column of enemy tanks, it could save hundreds of Allied lives in the long run. Yet moral ambiguity persisted. The deception relied on inviting the enemy to believe in mercy that was not offered. It turned the predictable compassion of engineers to mend and connect into a calculated betrayal. Some soldiers later admitted to feeling a strange guilt. Others saw it as a soldier's duty to employ every lawful means to defeat the enemy. Contemporary field manuals and later post-war analyses regarded the operation as legitimate under the rules of war at the time. The charges were military targets. The deception did not involve perfidy in its prohibited form. There were no signs of surrender or misuse of protected emblems. Still, the men who pulled the triggers carried memories that did not sit neatly in strategic reports. War does not always allow tidy moral accounting. That complexity is part of the story. It reveals how innovation in war often runs parallel to moral discomfort. It shows that close-knit units bound by shared danger can accept moral tension as part of their duty. They learn to compartmentalize, measure outcomes against cost, and carry on. The angles together human endurance, tactical ingenuity, technical precision, enemy assumptions, disciplined leadership, and moral complexity form the full picture of why a ruined bridge could be more than rubble. They explain not just how the trap was built, but why it had a chance to succeed. The engineers had done everything by the book, and some things beyond it. They had turned expectation into a weapon, and mechanism into theater. All that remained now was execution, the exact moment the Germans would step onto a stage of their own making, and the battlefield would decide which script would survive. December 28, 1944, the forest around the ruined bridge was frozen stiff, the kind of cold that cracked rifle stocks and numbed fingers through gloves. The fog was so dense it felt alive, rolling low across the river like a living curtain. Somewhere beyond it, the enemy moved. For days, the Americans had waited in the mist for engineers, infantry, artillery observers, each man rehearsing a single instant that could not be repeated. Every wire was checked again and again. Every range card is confirmed by a red-filtered flashlight. In the last hour before dawn, the stillness was so perfect that the river itself seemed to hold its breath. At 0445, the first sound came. Treads faint, metallic, deliberate. German half-tracks and light-armored cars moving cautiously along the frozen road. The engineers could not see them yet, but they could feel the vibration through the ground. The ambush had begun. Hidden behind the snow-dusted embankment, Lieutenant Harris of the 291st Engineers lifted his binoculars. Through the fog, he saw the faint outlines. 3 armored vehicles, a truck, and a column of infantry. Their pace was measured. Scouts advanced first, scanning the supposed repairs. To the Germans, the scene looked plausible, crude, but functional. The bridge decking appeared newly replaced, with rough planks nailed across surviving steel beams. Smoke rose faintly from a small fire pit on the near bank. A shovel leaned against a crate. It was all the small lies that made the big one believable. They saw what they expected to see. An Allied bridging team interrupted by weather or shell fire, struggling to reopen a route. They didn't know that each plank was hollowed to hide wire, and that the fire pit concealed a detonator buried beneath ash. By Zor 500, the German officer in charge gave the signal to proceed. One armored car rolled forward. Its front wheels hit the bridge deck, creaking over the timber. Nothing happened. The second followed. Still nothing. On the far bank, Harris's finger tightened on the firing switch, but he waited. The plan demanded patience. The trap had to hold until the maximum weight was committed, until retreat was impossible. The column began to accelerate. Infantrymen followed the armor, crossing in small groups, rifles slung, boots thudding against planks that disguised steel skeletons filled with C2 explosives. Then a change. A gust of wind lifted the fog for a moment, revealing an American helmet glinting faintly behind a mound of debris. The German officer barked a warning. Too late. Fire. Harris pressed the switch. The explosion wasn't one sound, but a dozen, overlapping: the tearing of steel, the thunder of shaped charges, the scream of disintegrating timber. The bridge didn't just collapse. It folded inwards exactly as calculated, trapping vehicles midspan. The river below erupted in fire and shards of steel as the hidden explosives tore through the structure's spine. German soldiers screamed as their vehicles pitched sideways. One armored car tumbled nose first into the water, flames bursting from its hatch. Others tried to reverse, only to find the rear planks already gone. The trap had closed. Before the echoes faded, American artillery answered. Pre-sighted 105mm howitzers opened up from behind the ridge. Shells struck the far bank, walking in a precise rhythm across the road where retreating troops now scattered in panic. The air filled with the deep, rhythmic percussion of high-explosive 3 rounds every 10 seconds, guided by observers who had memorized every coordinate. Machine guns from the concealed infantry positions opened next. Their tracers carved the fog into ribbons of red light. German officers tried to rally, shouting orders drowned out by the roar of detonations. Within 2 minutes, the column was in chaos. Vehicles burned, ammunition cooked off, and the narrow valley echoed with the metallic screams of ruptured steel. In the command dugout, Harris watched the scene unfold through binoculars, his expression unreadable. Around him, his men sat still, their faces pale in the dim light. They had built this, and now it was working exactly as planned. The engineers weren't trained killers by trade, they were builders. But on that morning, their construction became a perfect weapon. The bridge they had repaired destroyed an entire German spearhead before it could even fire a shot. Still, amid the thunder and smoke, the trap demanded control. The artillery would keep firing only as long as targets remained visible. Once the fog thickened again, they would cease for fear of hitting their own men. The engineers needed to assess damage to confirm if the enemy was finished or regrouping beyond sight. By Aero 520, the firing slowed. The fog returned, swallowing the scene. The engineers and infantry listened to the fading echoes, the crackle of burning fuel, the occasional burst of secondary ammunition igniting. The ambush had lasted less than 10 minutes, but the quiet that followed was heavier than sound. It wasn't a triumph yet. No one spoke. They knew the Germans might counterattack from another route, or shell the bridge in vengeance. Orders came down the line: hold positions, confirm casualties, and prepare secondary charges in case the enemy tried to recover wreckage. The engineers checked their fuses again, hands trembling slightly from adrenaline and cold. They had done what few soldiers could ever claim: they had built an illusion that killed, a weapon that began as architecture. Above the smoke, the first pale light of dawn broke across the valley. Snow drifted down, settling on the shattered remnants of the bridge, the grave of men who thought they were crossing to victory. The Americans knew the fight wasn't over. The explosion was only the opening act of something larger, because while that single trap shattered one German spearhead, it sent shockwaves through every nearby command post, forcing the enemy to reassess every crossing they had once trusted. December 28, 1944. The forest around the ruined bridge was frozen stiff, the kind of cold that cracked rifle stocks and numbed fingers through gloves. The fog was so dense it felt alive, rolling low across the river like a living curtain. Somewhere beyond it, the enemy moved. For days, the Americans had waited in the mist for engineers, infantry, artillery observers, each man rehearsing a single instant that could not be repeated. Every wire was checked again and again. Every range card is confirmed by a red-filtered flashlight. In the last hour before dawn, the stillness was so perfect that the river itself seemed to hold its breath. At 04:45, the first sound came. Treads faint, metallic, deliberate. German half-tracks and light-armored cars moving cautiously along the frozen road. The engineers could not see them yet, but they could feel the vibration through the ground. The ambush had begun. Hidden behind the snow-dusted embankment, Lieutenant Harris of the 291st Engineers lifted his binoculars. Through the fog, he saw the faint outlines: 3 armored vehicles, a truck, and a column of infantry. Their pace was measured. Scouts advanced first, scanning the supposed repairs. To the Germans, the scene looked plausible, crude but functional. The bridge decking appeared newly replaced, with rough planks nailed across surviving steel beams. Smoke rose faintly from a small fire pit on the near bank. A shovel leaned against a crate. It was all the small lies that made the big one believable. They saw what they expected to see: an Allied bridging team interrupted by weather or shell fire, struggling to reopen a route. They didn't know that each plank was hollowed to hide wire, and that the fire pit concealed a detonator buried beneath ash. By 0500, the German officer in charge gave the signal to proceed. One armored car rolled forward. Its front wheels hit the bridge deck, creaking over the timber. Nothing happened. The second followed. Still nothing. On the far bank, Harris's finger tightened on the firing switch, but he waited. The plan demanded patience. The trap had to hold until the maximum weight was committed, until retreat was impossible. The column began to accelerate. Infantrymen followed the armor, crossing in small groups, rifles slung, boots thudding against planks that disguised steel skeletons filled with C2 explosives. Then a change. A gust of wind lifted the fog for a moment, revealing an American helmet glinting faintly behind a mound of debris. The German officer barked a warning. Too late. Fire. Harris pressed the switch. The explosion wasn't one sound, but a dozen, overlapping, the tearing of steel, the thunder of shaped charges, the scream of disintegrating timber. The bridge didn't just collapse. It folded inwards exactly as calculated, trapping vehicles midspan. The river below erupted in fire and shards of steel as the hidden explosives tore through the structure's spine. German soldiers screamed as their vehicles pitched sideways. One armored car tumbled nose first into the water, flames bursting from its hatch. Others tried to reverse, only to find the rear planks already gone. The trap had closed. Before the echoes faded, American artillery answered. Pre-sighted 105mm howitzers opened up from behind the ridge. Shells struck the far bank, walking in a precise rhythm across the road where retreating troops now scattered in panic. The air filled with the deep, rhythmic percussion of high explosive 3 rounds every 10 seconds, guided by observers who had memorized every coordinate. Machine guns from the concealed infantry positions opened next. Their tracers carved the fog into ribbons of red light. German officers tried to rally, shouting orders drowned out by the roar of detonations. Within 2 minutes, the column was in chaos. Vehicles burned, ammunition cooked off, and the narrow valley echoed with the metallic screams of ruptured steel. In the command dugout, Harris watched the scene unfold through binoculars, his expression unreadable. Around him, his men sat still, their faces pale in the dim light. They had built this, and now it was working exactly as planned. The engineers weren't trained killers by trade. They were builders. But on that morning, their construction became a perfect weapon. The bridge they had repaired destroyed an entire German spearhead before it could even fire a shot. Still, amid the thunder and smoke, the trap demanded control. The artillery would keep firing only as long as targets remained visible. Once the fog thickened again, they would cease for fear of hitting their own men. The engineers needed to assess damage to confirm if the enemy was finished or regrouping beyond sight. By 05:20, the firing slowed. The fog returned, swallowing the scene. The engineers and infantry listened to the fading echoes, the crackle of burning fuel, the occasional burst of secondary ammunition igniting. The ambush had lasted less than 10 minutes, but the quiet that followed was heavier than sound. It wasn't a triumph yet. No one spoke. They knew the Germans might counterattack from another route. or shell the bridge in vengeance. Orders came down the line: hold positions, confirm casualties, and prepare secondary charges in case the enemy tried to recover wreckage. The engineers checked their fuses again, hands trembling slightly from adrenaline and cold. They had done what few soldiers could ever claim: they had built an illusion that killed, a weapon that began as architecture. Above the smoke, the first pale light of dawn broke across the valley. Snow drifted down, settling on the shattered remnants of the bridge, the grave of men who thought they were crossing to victory. The Americans knew the fight wasn't over. The explosion was only the opening act of something larger, because while that single trap shattered one German spearhead, it sent shockwaves through every nearby command post, forcing the enemy to reassess every crossing they had once trusted. December 28, 1944. The valley that had been silent hours earlier was now a cauldron of sound, distant shells rumbling, radios crackling, and the hiss of burning fuel echoing between the hills. The bridge was gone, but the fight it started had only begun. Across the fog-covered river, the Germans scrambled to regroup. Survivors from the destroyed column staggered among the wreckage, shouting for medics, some dragging the wounded from the water's edge. Their officers were furious, convinced they'd been ambushed by hidden American armor or air power. None of them imagined that the devastation had come from a single engineer team working beneath the ruins of a bridge. At a forward observation post, Lieutenant Harris watched the smoke twisting into the wind. His radio operator handed him a headset. "Artillery command says targets are still moving beyond the ridge." "Orders?" Harris hesitated. The plan's goal was never to annihilate a single column. It was to paralyze the entire German advance across that sector. He looked at the map pinned to the dugout wall. The destroyed bridge wasn't just a structure, it was the artery between two divisions. Without it, enemy armor to the east was trapped, unable to reinforce the line pressing toward the Meuse River. He keyed the mic. "Tell the guns to shift 200 yards south. Hit the approach roads. Make them think we've mined every crossing from here to Bastogne." Within minutes, the howitzers began again. Their shells whistled overhead, hammering the frozen roads where new German vehicles were forming up. One after another, convoys halted, commanders unsure if they faced artillery fire or invisible mines. Confusion spread faster than the explosions. By dawn, the Germans had sealed off the area entirely. Patrols were sent to probe alternate fords downstream, but each move met the same illusion: decoy bridges, false repair signs, smoke screens that suggested engineers were working nearby. In reality, most of those sites were empty, and the Americans had created shadows, illusions to waste time and divide attention. For the men of the 291st, that time was priceless. Every hour the enemy hesitated meant more supplies reaching the front, more reinforcements crossing safely through secondary routes. The destroyed bridge wasn't just a tactical win, it was a psychological one. In their command bunker, German officers pored over reconnaissance photos taken before the attack. They saw what seemed like solid evidence of an active construction site: planks, beams, toolboxes, smoke. One colonel slammed his fist against the table. This was a trap. "They built it for us." The idea itself was infuriating, that the Americans would use deception not only to defend but to attack through engineering. It defied the Wehrmacht's mechanical logic. They had been trained to read terrain, not imagination. Back on the American side, the engineers emerged cautiously from their foxholes. The air still smelled of gunpowder and scorched oil. Across the river, twisted steel jutted from the current like ribs of a drowned beast. The sun's first light glinted off the water, revealing the frozen faces of the destroyed convoy. Some of the engineers crossed down to the shoreline to retrieve equipment. Every step cracked against the frost. They found fragments of German radios, burned helmets, and shattered rifle stocks washed up against the bank. Sergeant O'Neill picked up a half-melted iron cross still pinned to a shredded tunic. He stared at it quietly, then dropped it into the river. "We build to save lives," he murmured. "But today we built to end them." No one answered. War had blurred that line long ago. Later that morning, reconnaissance aircraft from the 9th Army flew over the area. The photos they captured told the full story: the collapsed span, the black scars of detonations, and wrecks scattered across the ice like broken toys. When the images reached headquarters, the reaction was immediate. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion was commended for extraordinary tactical ingenuity under enemy pressure. But for the men who had lived it, the glory felt hollow. They knew how close they had come to discovering how one careless sound or misplaced shadow could have turned the ambush against them. The success of the trap was as fragile as the bridge itself had been. Still, its impact rippled across the campaign. Within 48 hours, German commanders halted further crossing attempts in the area, convinced the Americans had wired every bridge and ford for demolition. This forced them into a costly detour, delaying an entire division's advance by nearly 2 days' time that allowed Allied forces to solidify their lines during the Battle of the Bulge's final phase. That night, the engineers gathered in their dugout. The fires from the river still glowed faintly beyond the tree line, painting their faces in flickering light. Harris sat apart, writing in his notebook not a report but a record of what they'd built and why. He wrote, "This bridge never stood, but it held the line." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and indifferent. Somewhere in the dark, artillery still rumbled, marking another fight, another deception, another stand. But for the men of the 291st, the sound carried a strange comfort, the rhythm of survival crafted from ingenuity. They had proven that in war, victory didn't always come from firepower or numbers. Sometimes it came from illusion, from turning a ruin into a weapon, from making the enemy believe what you wanted them to see. As dawn broke over the shattered river, the fog lifted one final time, revealing a battlefield both beautiful and terrible in its silence. The trap had done its work. The enemy's bridgehead was gone, and the Americans, those quiet, unseen builders, faded back into the mist, leaving behind only the wreckage of their deception. When the smoke cleared over the frozen valley, the trap's impact rippled far beyond the broken river crossing. For the men on the ground, it was a moment of stunned disbelief. For higher command, it was a small tactical event with outsized strategic consequences. Within hours of the explosion, intercepted German radio traffic painted a picture of chaos. Signal intelligence units at Allied headquarters recorded frantic transmissions from officers along the river line, conflicting orders, overlapping reports, and a desperate search for alternative routes. Commanders from the 9th Panzer Division believed they had stumbled into an American counterattack, spearheaded by armor and artillery. Others were convinced that Allied engineers had pre-wired every bridge in the region for demolition, making any crossing a death sentence. That confusion was exactly what the Americans had hoped to achieve. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, officially assigned to rear area construction duties, had unexpectedly shaped the tempo of battle across a 40-mile front. The Germans could no longer trust what they saw. Every burned span, every half-built structure became suspect. For Allied intelligence officers, the timing was perfect. The operation coincided with the final German thrust during the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great offensive in the West. While American infantry and armored units fought to hold Bastogne and push the Germans back toward the Rhine, even a minor delay in the enemy's logistics could alter outcomes. The destroyed bridge created exactly that: paralysis. Aerial reconnaissance taken the next day showed long columns of German trucks idling in forest clearings, their routes blocked by destroyed crossings and blown culverts. Engineers were forced to divert through secondary terrain, muddy, mined, and under artillery observation. Entire fuel convoys bogged down, consuming the very resource they were trying to deliver. Each hour lost in the maze of detours cost the Wehrmacht momentum it could never regain. Meanwhile, on the American side, the operation became an example of improvisation under pressure. Field reports from the 291st detailed every step of the deception: the bridge's construction, placement of explosives, camouflage, and timing. Those notes were later forwarded to Chef, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, and analyzed by engineers and intelligence officers studying field deception. The findings circulated quietly through command channels. Deception through reconstruction could be just as effective as demolition through retreat. The bridge trap also influenced the tone of the final Allied counteroffensives. Knowing that their engineers could weaponize ruins, commanders began to incorporate more denial operations, systematically turning damaged infrastructure into hidden defensive traps. At Remagen, days later, the discovery of an intact bridge over the Rhine sent a shock through both sides, because everyone expected it to explode the moment they saw it. That reflexive fear to mistrust what seemed functional was part of the psychological shadow left by the 291st's operation. Among the Germans, that same shadow took a different form. Reports captured after the war showed how shaken frontline officers were by what had happened. One entry from a Panzer regiment's war diary read, "The enemy disguises destruction as repair. We cannot approach their bridges without assuming they are false. This delays every operation." Another, more bitterly, noted, "Their engineers fight with invisible weapons." In tactical terms, the destroyed bridge delayed the German withdrawal and reorganization for nearly 48 hours, long enough for the U.S. 84th Infantry Division to secure a series of towns along the river and establish firm control of the area. 2 days later, aerial reconnaissance confirmed what the engineers already suspected. The enemy had abandoned the crossing sector entirely, but beyond the statistics and reports, the victory felt strangely intimate. For the engineers who had built the trap, it wasn't about medals or recognition. Most never received them. It was about proving that construction and destruction were two sides of the same discipline. That precision, timing, and logic could turn raw terrain into a weapon. By the first week of January 1945, the story had already spread through the engineering corps. Units from the 299th and 1110th visited the site days after the battle, studying the remains. They photographed the twisted steel, measured blast patterns, and sketched the sequence of detonations. In their eyes, the 291st had done something extraordinary. They had turned a bridge into a lesson. That lesson would soon echo far beyond that frozen river. In the months following the Battle of the Bulge, as winter melted into the cold rains of early 1945, the story of the destroyed bridge began circulating quietly through Allied engineering and intelligence circles. It was never broadcast as propaganda, nor written about in official communique. Instead, it passed through handshakes after action reports and lessons whispered across command tents. The operation was proof of a new kind of warfare, one where imagination could be as lethal as artillery. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion was not the first to destroy a bridge to halt the enemy, but they were among the first to weaponize reconstruction as a psychological tool. Their action blurred the line between combat engineering and deception operations, a fusion that would later influence how NATO militaries thought about battlefield engineering in the Cold War. In 1945, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began collecting field reports to compile a post-war study titled Engineer Operations in the European Theater. The 291st's action was included, stripped of names, but noted as an exemplary tactical deception employing combat engineering resources. The key takeaway was simple yet profound. An engineer's structure could serve as both lure and defense, a functional illusion in the service of strategic denial. By late 1946, U.S. and British staff colleges were teaching the event as part of denial and deception training. It was studied alongside examples like the Ghost Army, the famous 23rd Headquarters Special Troops who used inflatable tanks and sound effects to deceive German reconnaissance. But unlike the Ghost Army, the 291st's deception ended not in illusion but destruction, a calculated act that bridged artifice and lethality. It showed that deception did not require elaborate theatrics. It required understanding how the enemy thinks. Captured Wehrmacht engineering officers interviewed after the war often mentioned the growing paranoia about bridges and crossings in late 1944. One officer, Oberst Ernst Baumbach, described how repeated losses at seemingly repaired sites led his men to distrust their own reconnaissance. Every bridge looked like a trap. Even when it wasn't, we treated it as one. That alone slowed our movement more than the explosions themselves. That erosion of confidence was as valuable as any physical destruction. In the calculus of warfare, time and trust are currencies, and the Americans had managed to bankrupt both. When German officers reconstructed the timeline of their defeat in the Ardennes, they repeatedly cited delays in movement as one of the fatal causes. The bridge incident, as it was called in debriefings, was listed among minor but psychologically decisive setbacks, one that made commanders more cautious when boldness was needed most. For the men of the 291st, the war ended a few months later, when they crossed the Rhine and pushed toward Germany's industrial heartland. Some stayed in service. Others returned home to Qui,